Hello, and welcome to Recipes with Ben. In today's video, I'm going to show you how easy it is to make homemade hard cider from 3 simple ingredients that includes apple juice, yeast, and some yeast nutrient. And the only equipment you'll need is a fermenter and then a way to package it. So let's make some hard cider. The first step in making hard cider is adding 1 gallon of apple juice to a clean and sanitized fermenter, which in this case I'm using my SS Brewtech Brew Bucket Mini. It's important to note that the apple juice I got from the store is 100% unfiltered apple juice, which in the end leads to a hazy appearance. The most important factor when picking out apple juice from the store is that they don't contain any preservatives, such as things like sodium benzoate, citric acid, or potassium sorbate, as all these chemicals would inhibit the yeast activity and most likely lead to no fermentation. After adding the juice to the fermenter, I sprinkled about a half a teaspoon of yeast nutrient over the juice, which will help the yeast during fermentation as it provides essential nutrients that they need. Then the choice of yeast I chose for this specific fermentation was Lalemant's Verdant IPA Yeast, which I just sprinkled a healthy amount over the top, but you can use a yeast calculator if you want to figure out exactly how much you need for your batch size. Then I sealed up the top of the fermenter and gave it a vigorous shake to incorporate oxygen into the juice for the yeast. Then I pulled a small sample from the fermenter at the bottom to get original gravity of the juice. And like most apple juice you find at the store, the original gravity was 1050. And then I placed the airlock on top of that and allowed it to sit in my basement, which had a resting temperature about 64 degrees. I saw healthy airlock activity after about 24 hours, and this persisted for about 5 days total. And even though it was done after 5 days, I left it in the fermenter to rest for a total of 3 weeks from the start of fermentation. And then I moved on to put that in my keg. Then after 3 weeks, I removed the lid from the fermenter and grabbed a final gravity sample from the spout at the bottom of the bucket. And then I transferred the hard cider from the fermenter to my keg using a siphon, which took several minutes using gravity to transfer from the bucket to that keg. And overall, I got about 3/4 of a gallon's worth of hard cider out of 1 gallon of juice, as there was some loss at the bottom of the bucket. With all the cider inside, I sealed up the keg and moved on to adding CO2 to it. I set the pressure on the regulator of my CO2 tank to 20 psi and placed it in the fridge to cool down to drinking temperature overnight. The last thing I did before moving on to the tasting was take that final gravity reading, and this finished out at 1.000. So with all that said, let's get into the tasting and see how this cider turned out. Now, let's get into the tasting of the hard cider that I made. So the big thing I used for this cider was that I used the Verdant IPA yeast. This is a pretty good, clean fermenting yeast in my experience. I've used it to make both a milkshake kind of IPA or New England style IPA as well as stouts. It has a pretty good attenuation. Typical fermentation range is somewhere between like 64 and like 70, like 64 and like 68, somewhere in that. Typical for a lot of British yeasts. So right off the bat, it's got like the haze color, which almost reminds me of like the haze of like a New England IPA. I think this directly comes from the fact that the actual apple juice itself that I got from the store was unfiltered. So I think that just left it in solution. And then the yeast character, I think, also helped lead to that kind of haze. It has a nice like tight white head when it's first poured, but because there's not a whole lot of stuff in here to keep in solution, it dissipates pretty quickly. And this is only served at about 10 psi. For the gravity, as I think I said previously, most apple juice you buy is about 1050. And that's what this was, and it finished at 1.000, making this a 6.5% alcohol cider. So right on the bat, when we get into the tasting of it, you get this like lovely like apple juice note, I would say, is kind of the dominant feature. A little bit of honey. Yeah, it just kind of smells like what you'd imagine apple juice does. So let's taste it. It's got that like, the main thing I would say that's going on with this is that it's got a nice subtle apple flavor. It almost kind of reminds me of just like straight up apple juice, but with no sweetness added to it. Because it kind of finishes somewhere on the drier end. I didn't back sweeten this at all. I just put it in my keg and carved it to about 10 psi. But it's not dry, not like a wine or something like that where it's kind of almost tanny. It's just like clean and crisp. I bet this would be really good in the summertime because it's just so light and very, very drinkable. This is kind of what I think is just a starter if you're getting into fermentation, because you only need those couple ingredients I mentioned earlier. And the also nice thing about making a hard cider is that it's gluten-free. So if you have any friends who have a gluten intolerance, this is a great thing to share with them. I will say that this is kind of on the basic end in terms of the flavor. I would like to have a little bit more complexity to it. So maybe adding some spices in the future, maybe mixing it with another fruit. But the thing I'm really interested in trying is using that Lallemand Philly sour yeast to see how that works with cider, because that yeast first makes some it lowers the pH, and normally in beer, it will lower the pH down to like a sour level, and then it'll start the fermentation. So I wonder how this would work, because the yeast itself, I think, did a great job. I would definitely use the Verdant IPA yeast again to make a cider. Maybe it can have different yeast character if you use an actual cider yeast, but I think this is really good. I highly recommend this if you're just getting into fermentation and want something super simple, because the actual, I would say, brew day or the day to set this up maybe took 30 minutes to an hour, and that includes all the cleaning and sanitation and all that stuff. But once I poured it in, the yeast went to town and it went away, and 3 weeks later when I had space in my keg, kegged it up in a clean and sanitized keg, and yeah, have this on tap. It's also nice because you can just buy the apple juice from store and it's not very expensive. I would say that I was hoping in the fall, when I found a bunch of apples and I harvested them, I wanted to crush them and press them myself, but I couldn't find a reasonably priced location near me to rent the equipment. I found a bunch of places that did have pressers, but all their crushers were broken, and so I just decided I froze all those apples and used them in other things. Like I think on my channel you may have seen, I have apple cider donuts, and I have apple butter, which I made from those apples, and the rest I just froze. So in the future, I'd love to do that if I can find the equipment to do it and press it. But with all that said, I think, yeah, this is a great cider. It's very nice. It's very light. I definitely enjoy drinking this. And I've shared it with some family members, and they enjoyed it as well. So thanks for watching the video. If you found any of this helpful, give it a thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe down below so you don't miss the next video. And I'll see you again soon. Cheers.